I'm going to talk about water quality criteria. This is just an introduction, so it may go actually fast, and you might be able to get out of here a little bit early if you're not from California. So here's the obligatory disclaimer, and here's the first slide. So the first slide is about what are criteria, and criteria are basically statements about protecting designated uses. They can be numeric, they can be narrative. They apply to the water. They don't apply to anything. They apply to the water, so the water quality standards. You can read that if you like. I'll give you a second to read it. All right. Manjali showed this slide, and I'll just show it again to reinforce that EPA considers standards to be designated uses, the criteria to protect those uses, and an anti-degradation policy. Everything on the other side is implementation. So that's, TMDLs, 303D listings, everything. That's on the other side. The standards inform all those things, and they're the basis for all those things, but they are not those things. So what does the Clean Water Act say about criteria? There's a couple places in the Clean Water Act where they talk about them. One is 303C, which basically says that states and tribes shall adopt criteria to protect designated uses into their water quality standards. 303C is actually the authority at which we approve your water quality standard when you send it to us. The second place is it basically says that states and tribes shall adopt criteria for priority pollutants. And there's a list of priority pollutants, and they're very, very old. We have criteria for all of them. Criterion for all of them. I'm sorry. And these are in the regs, 131.11, and it basically says, when you adopt them, make sure that they're based on sound scientific evidence. Make sure that they're going to protect the most sensitive use, and make sure that they protect the designated use. You guys can read that? Criteria can take two forms. There's numeric, numbers, and there's narrative, statements about protecting water quality criteria. If you look at 40 CFR 131.11, it says that states establishing criteria should establish numerical based on guidance, what we call our 304A guidance. And these are the numbers that headquarters comes up and they list on their EPA website. And they're the basis for which we use in determining whether or not the objectives used in California or the standards that you use in Hawaii are protective, right? So what we're looking at is it protective of the use? And the easiest thing for us to do is it as protective as our criteria, our 304A criteria? You can modify standards, right? By sometimes the criteria are reflected by site-specific conditions. An example of that is like hardness-based criteria, right? So they're not just one number, they're an equation. And depending on what the hardness is, they'll change. Ammonia is another one. And then there's this other thing that says, oh yeah, and you can use other scientifically defensible methods to come up with these criteria. And again, you guys have to provide us with the information. If we deem that it is, defensible and protective and meets all the items, then we will approve it. Then there's a narrative criteria, right? So you can't come up with a number, so you have some statement of intent. We want to protect, these uses, and we don't know what the number is, so we say, thou shalt not hurt organisms, or thou shalt not have substances in organisms that cause, nutrient pollution or something like that. And we encourage states to have ways to translate those narratives into permits. A couple ways that you can develop narrative criteria is based on biomonitoring methods. So if you know you have a relationship between, you know, bugs and, let's say, nitrogen, then maybe you can develop a little relationship there. I'm trying to remember what this was. Where numerical criteria cannot be established. Oh, right. So we have these things also where you can't develop a numeric criteria. So remember how I defined criteria before? This is the other criteria. So there's two places in the Clean Water Act where we use criteria in different ways. So this is referring to the 304A criteria. So Section 304A of the Clean Water Act says that EPA shall develop, you know, numbers to protect uses for all the important priority pollutants, and you know, they're based on the latest guidance. They're the things that our folks in headquarters, our Office of Science Technology, develop. They're the things that our folks in the State Health Protection Division, where Monjali works, sort of help to frame and to bring out. These are the things that we do notices on and you can public comment on. And then this final point is that, you know, if we have to do a promulgation, we're going to use those 304A numbers to promulgate because they reflect the best science as far as we know it. So where are these 304A criteria? They're on the internet. And so, I mean, I don't have this bookmarked. I just go, you know, EPA aquatic life criteria, or EPA human health criteria, or EPA recreational criteria. That's the easiest way to get to these tables. Do I have to go through these? Let me see. Yeah, so this is an example of, I can't read it here, so I have to look up here, of cadmium. And so these tables are all very similar. They have freshwater and saltwater. They have the acute number and the chronic number. And then they have the publication date and any information that you need. And often they'll have a link to the development of the criteria, so you can go to the document and see how it was developed if you're interested in it. So here's an example of a numeric criteria. To protect aquatic life use, dissolved zinc shall not exceed 90 micrograms per liter as a 1 hour average, more than once every 3 years. So this is a numeric criteria. It has three things. It has a magnitude, it has a duration, and it has a frequency. Those things are important for water quality criteria. Because if you just had a number, you know, when do you exceed it? How often can you exceed it? Narrative criteria. These are the free-form criteria. You'll see them. Again, it's where you can't develop a numeric. This example, which I can read, I guess, or you can read. Surface waters shall be free from substances attributed to wastewater discharges or other pollutant sources that cause injury to or are toxic to or produce adverse physiological responses in human, animals, and plants. So it's pretty all-encompassing. And then there is this note, which I kind of mentioned before, that you must provide a method for translating narrative criteria into something that can be used in a permit. So the rest will go, I think, fairly fast. We're going to talk about the types of criteria. There's aquatic life criteria to protect aquatic life. What is aquatic life? Anybody? What? How about if I just pick on someone who's talking? June?
No, it's a bowl of fish, for example.
Yeah, fishables. Yeah, fishable. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. A biological criteria. What's that? What's an example of that? Anybody? Bugs or fish. or algae, right? Human health criteria, an example. Toxicity is probably not a human health criteria. It's kind of more like an aquatic life criteria, I would guess. Copper, yeah. So, or DDT, you want to protect folks from getting sick from eating fish that have DDT or PCBs. How about a recreational criteria? Sweet. That was easy. Is there another one? Anyone can think of? Yeah, like cyanotoxins, microcystin and cylindrospermopsin, right? So we just put out one. And then other types of criteria are things like, nutrient criteria or sediment criteria. The state board just established sediment quality objectives, which are approved as criteria. So aquatic life criteria components, they have a magnitude, how much can they have, a duration, over what time period, and a frequency. And so this example is to protect aquatic life from acute toxicity in salt water, dissolved zinc shall not exceed 90 micrograms per liter as a 1 hour average over every 3 years. Okay, so once every 3 years. Here's an example of aquatic life criteria. Acute value to protect a short-term, these are just what they usually include. An acute value to protect from short-term, so that's the acute, and a chronic value to protect against long-term exposure. And then there's separate ones for salt water and fresh water, as you saw in the example. And there's an example, which I'm not going to read because I'm tired of reading, but here we have a salt water, here we have a salt water chronic, it's acute and chronic. So you'll see these things in the tables. And sometimes we might not have, if we look at the EPA tables, sometimes we just have one side, not the other side. Sometimes we have a human health, but not a aquatic life. So just be careful when you look at those things. There's a question, okay.
Yeah, can you explain the difference between an acute and a chronic criterion here? Would we, when we're sampling, do we have to have 4 days worth of samples in order to apply the chronic criterion?
No. I know that some folks have made those arguments. We've tried to squash those arguments. And so basically, we've used these, so like in a permit situation, an acute criteria might be a shorter, and a chronic might have a longer period. You might have different values. But no, you don't have to have 4 days of data to come up with a saltwater chronic. Yeah, so these tend to be based on lab studies. What EPA does is they basically scour the literature. They identify the literature that meets certain data quality requirements. And then they put these things together, and there'll be an entire module on how to develop aquatic life criteria tomorrow. Tomorrow's going to be a big day because it's going to be a lot of hands-on activities. Human health criteria are to protect humans from adverse, contaminants. They're calculated based on, how bad is the pollutant, right? What types of exposure, where it's going to affect, what type of organ it's going to affect. And then we also have there's sort of two classes in the EPA table. There's one if it's just organism only. If that's all you care about, like maybe salt water, you're not going to drink it, so an organism only is okay for that. Whereas in a freshwater, where the water could be used for both drinking and fish tissue, then an organism plus a water number would be appropriate. Okay. There'll be an entire module on this also tomorrow. Recreational criteria are to protect people from, protect the use of swimming. They're usually based on bacteria. It's to protect, whether you're going to consume by drinking and, exposure. We're really looking at fecally contaminated waters. And it's important to note, and I'll probably stress tomorrow since I'm going over this one, that things that we measure, like Enterococcus and E. coli, don't get you sick. These are just indicators of waste. And so, but they're easier to measure than viruses, which do get you sick. EPA has published criteria based on epidemiological studies. And does anyone know what can give me an example of an epi study? Okay, so basically what you do is you go out to a beach and you ask people before they swim to fill out a questionnaire. You ask people after they swim to fill out a questionnaire. You monitor the water, and then you're basically looking, who got sick and what was the water quality concentration at that time. Biocriteria, or biological criteria, is sort of I think, fundamental. The Clean Water Act talks about protecting the physical, chemical, and biological integrity, and we focused a lot over the past 40 years on the chemical, not so much the physical and not so much the biological. But if you think about it, that's really what we're aiming to protect, right, the biology. And so these are direct measures, and it's based, I've got 10 minutes, excellent. I will finish in 10. It's based on the premise that, if we understand what are good bugs in a reference condition, then we can evaluate bugs in a non-reference condition and see how far from reference they are. I'm not reading, so you guys can read these slides. So a couple of forms of biocriteria are, they could be a narrative, or some states have numeric. This happens to be a case, I believe, from Maine, where they have class waters. Matt talked about class waters before. And so they have indices based on taxa richness and EPT, which is Ephemeroptera. Thank you. Thank you, because I couldn't remember. Nutrient criteria. This has been a big push for EPA over the past 20 years. I think this is a really, really important thing. We have, well, I'll just read. So these are expressions of allowable levels of nutrients, like nitrogen, that are protective of aquatic life. Sometimes you use response variables like, percent algal cover, or you could also protect recreational use, like the Cylindrospermopsum case. And EPA is really encouraging the use of nutrient criteria. And these are also challenging because not all water body type are the same, and so sometimes you have to do different things in different water body types. Sometimes you have to do some classification and figure out that the response to nitrogen and phosphorus might be different in different types of streams or lakes, depending on a number of things. Also, nutrient criteria are complex, right? It's not just like a human health criteria where we're looking at DDT, the toxicology DDT, how much you eat, how much you're exposed to, and what the effects are. The effects here are sort of multiple, and there's multiple routes, and we'll go over this tomorrow. We also have a model in the presentation tomorrow. And it's not just nitrogen and phosphorus. There's a lot of other things that interact with nitrogen and phosphorus. And it's not just, one beneficial use. It can be multiple beneficial uses. So this is closing. This is our goal, is to let you see in practice how we derived the national recommendations, recognizing that you may want to tailor these to your region or state or tribe. And you don't need to start from scratch. You can just use ours. But if there's some reason that ours don't work for you, then you start going into the site-specific development criteria approach. But it's a lot of work to develop criteria, so I think sometimes just using ours is the easiest thing to do. So I have review questions, just like Matt, and there's 5 of them. So what's the primary purpose of criteria? Somebody. Raise your hand. I'll pick on you. Cynthia. To protect designated uses. Excellent answer. What are 304A criteria? Someone else raise their hand. Don't be shy. I'll pick on you if you don't. 304A criteria. Yeah, they're the numbers that are designed to protect the priority pollutants, right? The numbers that are protective designated uses that EPA has established for a number of pollutants.
They're recommended.
They're recommended, right? They're not law. They're just recommended.
So can we consider them in our terrain review process?
You should. In fact, in the more recent, in the 2015 reg revision, when folks are doing their triennial review, we ask folks to, look at our 304A criteria and adopt them if appropriate. And if you don't adopt them or you just ignore us, please explain why you're ignoring us, so we can have it in the public record. And it's a thing of transparency. Well, what do you do when there's multiple designated uses? What must the criteria protect? Rosalind?
Most sensitive.
The most sensitive, yay. And finally, how are criteria implemented? Yeah, go ahead.
Discharge permits.
Just discharge permits? Yeah, okay. Anything else? TMDLs, excellent. And then finally, there was a bonus question. Where were most of the pictures in this presentation from? I want to be fair. I'm going to go through them again. There's one. There's one. There's one. Okay. How about that one? So where were they from?
Region 9.
No, not Region 9. Huh? No, they weren't all Tahoe. Nevada. All right. That's the bonus prize. Okay, that's it for the California.